Welcome to your free English lesson. This series will focus on sentences. This lesson will cover complex sentences. It is important to write when you are asked to. It helps you to learn. You can use a whiteboard, but ideally a notebook would be best. That way, you can keep a record of your learning. There are 5 intended learning outcomes to achieve by the end of the lesson. 1. We are learning to define complex sentences. 2. We are learning to identify independent clauses. 3. We are learning to identify dependent clauses. 4. We are learning to use relative pronouns and relative adverbs to introduce a relative adjectival clause. 5. We are learning to write complex sentences using statements, questions, imperatives, and exclamations. A complex sentence is a sentence that has one independent clause and at least one dependent subordinate clause. The independent clause can stand alone as a complete sentence. The dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. Dependent clauses can be introduced by a subordinating conjunction, a relative pronoun, or a relative adverb, and they can also function as noun clauses. A complex sentence has only one independent clause. Any other clauses are dependent. This means only one part can stand alone. The other part depends on it. Dependent clauses are commonly categorized as adverbial clauses, introduced by subordinating conjunctions such as because, although, if. Relative clauses, also known as adjectival clauses, which are introduced by relative pronouns and relative adverbs such as who, which, that. And noun clauses, which are often introduced by that, whether, if, or WH words. This lesson will focus on relative adjectival clauses that are introduced by relative pronouns and relative adverbs. Relative clauses give extra information about a noun. There are 2 types. Defining relative clauses. This clause tells us exactly which person or thing we are talking about. The relative pronoun that is common and only used in defining relative clauses. The key question to ask is, do we need this information to know which person or thing we mean? Here is an example sentence. I like the book that you gave me. Without the relative clause, the sentence is unclear or incomplete. Which book? Without the relative clause, that you gave me, it is not clear which book the speaker is talking about. Commas are not used for punctuation with defining relative clauses. Relative pronouns in defining relative clauses can be omitted when it is the object. So for example, I like the book that you gave me. The relative pronoun is that. This sentence can also be expressed, I like the book you gave me. In the second expression, that has been omitted. Non-defining relative clauses. This clause gives extra information, not needed to identify the noun. The noun is already clear. The noun is often a name, unique thing, or a noun preceded by a determiner For example, my brother, who lives in Canada, is a teacher. Who lives in Canada is the non-defining relative clause. It's giving extra information about my brother. Notice the commas. Commas are always used with non-defining relative clauses. When speaking, pauses are essential where the commas are. Listen again. My brother, who lives in Canada, is a teacher. In non-defining relative clauses, the relative pronouns who, which, whose, and where are used. That is never used. The relative pronoun cannot be omitted in a non-defining relative clause. For example, my brother, who lives in Canada, is a teacher. That means my brother lives in Canada, is a teacher does not make sense. There must be the relative pronoun. Here is an example of a defining relative clause. Noun plus relative word plus information plus rest of clause. The city where I was born is small. Notice the noun plus the rest of the clause is an independent clause. The city is small. It makes sense as a standalone sentence. The relative clause is where I was born. Do we need this information to know which city is small? Yes, relative clauses are part of the noun, not a separate clause joined by a conjunction. Now, as a complex sentence, this sentence is expressed: the city where I was born is small. Here is an example of a non-defining relative clause. Noun plus relative word plus information plus rest of clause. My mum, who works at night, is tired. Notice the independent clause. My mum is tired. It makes sense as a standalone sentence. The relative clause is who works at night. Do we need this information to tell who my mum is? No, it is extra information. Now, as a complex sentence, the sentence would be expressed: my mum, who works at night, is tired. A relative pronoun is a word that replaces a noun and refers back to it. In these example sentences, the relative pronoun is bold and the relative clause is underlined. The relative pronoun who is used for people as a subject. For example, the woman who lives here is kind. The relative pronoun whom is used for people as an object in formal expressions. For example, the man whom I met was helpful. The relative pronoun whose is used for possession, people and things. For example, the student whose bag is missing is upset. The relative pronoun which is used for things, animals, and ideas. For example, the book which I bought is new. The relative pronoun that is used for people and things in defining relative clauses. For example, the film that we watched is good. A relative adverb is a word that links to place, time, or reason. In these example sentences, the relative adverb is bold and the relative clause is underlined. The relative adverb where refers to place. For example, the school where I study is very big. The relative adverb when refers to time. For example, I remember the day when we first met. The relative adverb why refers to reason. For example, that is the reason why he left. The relative adverb which is a comment on an idea. For example, he failed the exam, which surprised me. The relative adverb whereby refers to a method or process. For example, a system whereby students are assessed. The relative adverb when in formal time references refers to formal writing. For example, a period when change was rapid. A declarative sentence makes a statement or gives information. Its function is to state facts, opinions, and descriptions. The punctuation at the end of a declarative sentence is a full stop. Form. The word order is usually subject plus verb plus object adverbial or complement. Here are examples of statements with a defining relative clause. Remember, relative clauses follow the noun. The relative clauses are in red. Relative clause in the middle, noun plus relative adverb plus information plus rest of clause. The city where she lives has many parks. Relative clause at the end, determiner plus verb plus noun plus relative adverb plus information. This is the cafe where we met. Here is an example of a statement with a non-defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, determiner plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. Her car, which is very old, still runs well. Although there is another structure, it is not commonly used. This is the clearest structure to learn. An interrogative asks a question. Its function is to request information or confirmation. The punctuation used at the end of an interrogative is a question mark. Intonation. There is a rising tone at the end of the interrogative for yes and no questions. For WH questions, there is a variable tone. Here are examples of questions with a defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, question word plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. What movie that we watched did you like best? Relative clause at the end, question word plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. Who is the teacher who helped you yesterday? Here are examples of questions with a non-defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. Laura, whose sister you met, is joining us, isn't she? Relative clause at the end, question word plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. Did you meet Anna, who just moved here? An imperative gives a command, request, instruction, or invitation. Its function is to ask someone to do or not do something. The punctuation at the end of an imperative is a full stop, but it can take an exclamation mark for force. Form. The word order is varied and requires an implied subject. Here are examples of imperatives with a defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, verb plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. Call the customer whose order was delayed immediately. Relative clause at the end, verb plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. Avoid the roads that are flooded. Here are examples of imperatives with a non-defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, verb plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. Ask Sarah, who you met last week, for advice. Relative clause at the end, verb plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. Don't use this machine, which is out of order. An exclamatory expresses a strong feeling or emotion. Its function is to show surprise, excitement, joy, anger, and admiration. The punctuation at the end of an exclamation is an exclamation mark. The form. The word order is usually subject plus verb plus object, adverbial, or complement. Here are examples of exclamations with a defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, determiner plus adjective plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. How amazing the doctor who treated us yesterday is. Relative clause at the end, determiner plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. What a movie that keeps you on the edge of your seat. Here are examples of exclamations with a non-defining relative clause. Relative clause in the middle, determiner plus adjective plus noun plus relative pronoun plus information plus rest of clause. How impressive the student who solved the hardest problem is. Relative clause at the end, determiner plus rest of clause plus relative pronoun plus information. What a city where everyone is so friendly. Read the clauses. Ask yourself, am I replacing the noun, or am I giving extra information about place, time, or reason? Then choose a relative pronoun or relative adverb that appropriately completes the complex sentences. Relative clause in the middle. The painting was sold for $1 million is in the museum. Relative clause at the end. I met the man, helped with my bags. Pause the video. The next slide contains the answers. Check your answers. Relative clause in the middle. The painting, which was sold for $1 million, is in the museum. Relative clause at the end. I met the man who helped with my bags. Relative clause in the middle. Which city you visited last summer did you like best? Relative clause at the end. Who is the teacher? explained this to you? Pause the video. The next slide contains the answers. Check your answers. Relative clause in the middle. Which city that you visited last summer did you like best? Relative clause at the end. Who was the teacher that explained this to you? Relative clause in the middle. Talk to the person is in charge about it. Relative clause at the end. Follow these instructions are quite simple. Pause the video. The next slide contains the answers. Check your answers. Relative clause in the middle. Talk to the person who is in charge about it. Relative clause at the end. Follow these instructions, which are quite simple. Relative clause in the middle. How amazing the book changed my life is. Relative clause at the end. How amazing the singer is. Voice moved everyone. Pause the video. The next slide contains the answers. Check your answers. Relative clause in the middle. How amazing the book that changed my life is. Relative clause at the end. How amazing the singer is, whose voice moved everyone. Here is an extender for anybody who would like a challenge. Each item gives 2 simple sentences. Rewrite them as one complex sentence using a defining relative clause or a non-defining relative clause. 1. I spoke to a teacher. The teacher helped me with my work. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a defining relative clause. 2. She bought a dress. The dress fits her perfectly. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a defining relative clause. 3. We visited a museum. The museum displays ancient artifacts. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a defining relative clause. 4. My brother lives in London. He works as an architect. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a non-defining relative clause. 5. The Eiffel Tower is in Paris. It attracts millions of tourists every year. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a non-defining relative clause. 6. Saskia won the competition. Her performance impressed the judges. Rewrite this as a complex sentence using a non-defining relative clause. Pause the video. The next slide contains the answers. Check your answers. 1. I spoke to a teacher who helped me with my work. 2. She bought a dress that fits her perfectly, which is also acceptable, so she bought a dress which fits her perfectly. 3. We visited a museum which displays ancient artifacts. That is also acceptable, so we visited a museum that displays ancient artifacts. 4. My brother, who works as an architect, lives in London. The sentence could also read, my brother, who lives in London, works as an architect. 5. The Eiffel Tower, which attracts millions of tourists every year, is in Paris. 6. Saskia, whose performance impressed the judges, won the competition. Thank you for watching this video. Watch it as many times as you need to master the intended learning outcomes. I hope that the content helped you to learn more about complex sentences. Please like and subscribe for more lessons. There is a lot to learn, so don't give up. Keep believing in yourself, and you will learn. See you next time. Bye.